from the heart of Dubai, where tomorrow is being built today, to the world. Welcome to the CTO Show with Mehmet. Here, we redefine technology and reimagine possibilities. With Mehmet, delve into the riveting realms of AI, cybersecurity, and digital technology. Experience the thrilling highs and lows of startups. Immerse yourself in the spirit of entrepreneurship and witness the future of business innovation being written in real time. Now, without further ado, let's tune in and explore the future.
Hello and welcome back to a new episode of the CTO Show with Mehmet. Today, I'm very pleased. Joining me from the US, Ted Dintersmith. Ted is a bestseller author. He was a venture capitalist, and now he's focusing on education. But as you know, audience, like I like to keep people to speak about themselves because I have a theory. No one can talk better about anyone else other than themselves. So Ted, thank you very much for being here with me today on the show. A little bit about you. So for people who might not know you, your journey and what you're currently up to, and then we're going to take the conversation from there. But I'm going to give a teaser for the audience. We're going to discuss a lot of things. So we're going to talk about math, but you're going to understand why. We're going to talk about AI, education, and a little bit about startups also as well. So Ted, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Sure. So I spent way too many years in school, a lot of years in school, but I ended up with a PhD in a math modeling program at Stanford. My first job was with a startup business that made, it sounds laughable today, single purpose integrated circuits that cost $400 in 1983. And all they did was multiply two fixed point numbers together quickly. But what was so interesting for me about that is that we were selling those to all the systems companies that were essentially paving the way for the digital revolution. And so after doing that for several years, I shifted gears, went into venture capital, worked with a top firm in Boston at the time, Charles River Ventures, loved my time in venture capital. And then as my kids got further along in school, toward middle school, I'd say, I just looked and I said, wait a minute, what they're being required to do, how they're being graded, what they're being assessed on, the material they're learning, not only is it preparing them for a world that begs for creativity and entrepreneurial mindsets, it's actually jeopardizing those mindsets and those skills. So I dropped my venture capital career and took up being kind of a warrior on the cause of aligning education priorities with what will really prepare us for life. And education resources don't necessarily limit themselves to K through 12 or K through college. They can be community colleges, boot camps. They can be a whole range of things because there are really none of us, no matter what our age, that wouldn't benefit from upgrading our skills and expanding our mind horizons.
Ted, there was something while I was preparing for the episode today that you said, which immediately I was hooked because I felt that there is something wrong, but it's good to hear it from you. So you said we studied the wrong math for decades. And I felt this honestly
Yeah.
for ages. But what do you think is the right math that we have missed? And why do you think it was kept out of the classrooms? Why they didn't teach us about it?
Yeah. And I'll send you for show notes this Where's Waldo mosaic of all the topics that are covered in high school math. And I use that with large audiences. And my challenge to the audience is basically find something on here you use and can explain. So it's like 75 topics, Taylor series expansion, the chain rule, sum of angles in a pentagon, on and on and on. No one can do it. I mean, these are hundreds, even, few thousand adults, and no one can find anything. I think the key point is, I graduated high school in 1970. Before 1970, the math we studied did make sense. There really weren't readily available computational resources. There were many professions that required humans to be able to carry out rote mathematical exercises quickly by hand, error-free. So that used to be, and I emphasize used to be, an important skill. Now computers are at our fingertips. Nobody needs to, factor x cubed minus 3x squared plus 2x minus 5 or something. I mean, it's just a whole set of low-level math esoterica that somehow remains in the curriculum. And the reason it sticks in our curriculum, it is the essence of our high-stakes exams. So we literally hold kids accountable to, hold teachers and schools accountable to, have everyone spend thousands of hours on rote math mechanics that adults don't use and your smartphone does perfectly. And it's used punitively. It may be of some marginal benefit to adults that pursue math-based careers because you get fluent in symbols and abstract thinking and the logic of math. And I appreciate that. That was definitely true for me. But that's a tiny sliver of the population. And for most, it just makes them hate math. And they leave with no real skills to show for it. And so I wrote this book about the ideas of math that we all need to understand, with an invitation to use artificial intelligence as your thought partner to carry out the mechanics. And, I'm very excited about the book. It's a little bit of a lift, I'll be honest, when you say to people, hey, I've got a book that makes math exciting and interesting with concepts you're going to understand. There's a degree of skepticism. Like a lot of, and this is the heartbreak, right? A lot of people, as soon as you say math, the blood drains out of their face. And it's just like, I don't ever want to go back to that. And how sad is that?
It is sad. For me, even when I was in school and high school, although I studied engineering, so I needed math. Um, but I was always asking myself, like, why we need to memorize all these like old formulas? Calculators were available, at least at my age, but still, no, calculators not allowed. But I was telling, I was arguing sometimes. Okay, but after I finish college, I'm gonna use the calculator because it's faster to do it with a calculator rather than I do it myself. Now there is a camp chat they used to say that yeah, we were doing this or we're still doing this because we want also the students to get their brain muscles working and they need to do this. Do you agree with that, or that's a complete myth?
Yeah, it's certainly the defense, right? When I say to people, just look, these are all the things that are covered in high school math. No one adult, and people, it's not just me. I mean, other people have looked into it, and it's a tiny proportion of people that use any high school math beyond fractions and ratios. That the line of defense is often yes, but this is teaching kids how to think. This is the magic of problem solving. And 2 points on that. I mean, there's almost no evidence for that. The one organization that squirreled together the funds to look at it was the Rand Corporation. And I quote the results of their study in my book, but they looked at the math that populates the high stakes high school exams and concluded there was 0% of it. 0% of it was related to deeper learning. The second thing, though, I'd say is that anything can be a vehicle for teaching us how to think, playing the piano, cooking, needlepoint, rote math mechanics. And if you visit schools in a place like Finland, where it's very different from the United States, and each nation has its different set of priorities and mix. But in Finland, they'll often put a really interesting problem on the board and then encourage the students to come up with as many different ways to solve it. And there's clearly benefit from that. Even factoring polynomials, I think that'd be a very interesting challenge for kids to say, why was this important? How did this used to be used before it was all integrated into software? But that's not what we do. In the United States, these test scores are such high stakes. When I visit, and I visit a lot of schools, the basic mandate there is, we're going to teach you one way to do it, and we will actually mark you down if you don't do it the way we taught you. And the reason for that is it's speed, efficiency, and accuracy, right? And so when you see a kid that is marked wrong for getting a really interesting answer because they didn't do it how they're taught, I mean, that's heartbreaking. But the book goes right at a lot of math concepts that beg for creativity. And I think your audience, no matter what walk they're in, can relate. In my business career, I used estimation all the time. How do I estimate a market size? Prediction. What do I predict future revenues will be? How do I optimize an allocation of resources across our fund or within a portfolio company? What algorithms are behind the work of these companies? How do you make important math-based but creativity and logic-based decisions? These things are all very interesting, right? But they're not one right answer things. They're creative and expansive challenges. And just to stick with that example, I mean, how do you estimate market size? Like there can be really great approaches to that. There are important trade-offs between the cost and the accuracy. It begs for precise definitions. Companies, I've seen many startups go way wrong on poor estimates of market size. I've seen companies nail it because they had a clue. They're really important skills, but because there's not one right answer, they don't fit into high-stakes standardized exams. And because they're not on the high-stakes exams, they're not in the classroom.
Did your career as a venture capitalist also expose some of these things for you? Just because you were mentioning about the valuation of the companies, because I mentor sometimes entrepreneurs part of a program, and every time we reach the financial modeling and we reach the preparing kind of a ask for investors, I would say 95% of the people freaks out because they said, "Oh, it's math. We are afraid of it. We don't want to do it, or we want to get someone expert in math." And then I go back to them and said, "Hey, like it's not the case." But like how this also affected maybe even sometimes startups and entrepreneurs who are looking for raising funds in freaking out because it's math, it's complex, we don't know how to do it. So either they go and do it wrong, or maybe I don't know, maybe of course you have more experience. What went wrong with them? Like how this affected negatively on startups and businesses in general?
Yeah, and you're right about people often freaking out. And I think a lot of people just get lost in a blur of symbols and abstraction that it shouldn't necessarily be the case. And in my book, I start each of these chapters intentionally with something I've participated in or observed with kids in sort of grades 3 through 8, just to make the point that you don't need an advanced degree to come up with creative ways to estimate how many jelly beans are in a jar. But what I observe, and I was in venture for a long time, and so I've easily been in 1,000 board meetings, is all the time, kind of on the fly, we'd say, well, what if we change this? Like how would that play out for revenue streams and costs over the next 3 to 8 quarters? And that there's sort of that ballpark estimates based on a clear understanding of what you want to accomplish, based on almost like back of the envelope calculations where you understand the ideas. And now with AI, when I started writing the book, ChatGPT often couldn't add numbers together. I mean, it was quite primitive when it came to math capability. And you probably read, many of your listeners will have seen the recent results where ChatGPT was in the top 10% of the International Math Olympiad. So these are the very best high school kids, generally seniors globally, taking on very difficult math-based problems. And without even reformatting them for the LLM, ChatGPT top 10% today, or a couple months ago. And you know that in a year or two, it'll be the top 1%, and then it will be better than any human could ever do. The point there is AI can do the rote mechanics. What humans need to understand are the core ideas, which are relevant, what questions to ask, what things to push on, and how to connect them to what's going on in their life. And you'll see it, like we want to put in a new data center. Great example. I was talking to somebody yesterday whose job was to raise funds for these cavernous data centers. And, we were talking, I said, like, what kind of math do you use for that? Well, we've got to estimate the overall budget. We've got to predict the cost over time of energy for this facility. We've got to predict the demand. We've got to understand how we can optimize around most recent advances in chip technology. It's replete with interesting math ideas. And I sort of as a joke said, and how often do you use arcsequence? And, people just look at you like you've lost your mind. I mean, of course, nobody uses arcsequence or And even no one does. I mean, even scientists and engineers aren't doing complex closed form integrals by hand. Yet we continue to make calculus, which is exactly that in high schools, the high water mark for math education, and often forsake, by the way, statistics in the process, which is essential for career, for citizenship and life.
Yeah, like it's unfortunate. Like we force people, I mean students mainly, to take things that they don't like. I decided to take, an approach with my daughter, honestly. She doesn't like math, right? She's in high school. She doesn't like math. Like every parent I know in my place, oh no, math is important. We need to get another tutor at home to make you stronger at math. I said, look, fine. Like if you don't like math, it's not the end of the world. Like, but you need to know if you need to have something to calculate how to use tools to get the answer that you want. And guess what? She got better grades in math because I did that.
No,
Now,
yeah. I mean, once they see
yeah,
the relevance, once they feel like this could actually make a difference in my life, there's more motivation. And yet the way we approach it, right, is we show them no relevance in life. And, would I love to change everything about the math curriculum? I would. But that said, I think if a kid can see ways that math is relevant, they will take the math they're assigned more seriously.
absolutely. Because once they see the practical side of it, actually they enjoyed it. If you ask them, they would enjoy. If they feel they are doing something practical with it, like not just the theory. I always remember myself, like of course, high school, university, we studied a lot about differential equations, integrals, and I don't remember any of this now, of course. Now, but the other thing, Ted, which is related to education is, and you touched base a little bit on it, but how we can change that, which is we put the students in, let's say, 1 hour, 2 hours time frame, and we expect from them to answer an exam, and then we measure them if they are successful or not. How do you think, what do you think we should do to change this also as well? Still today, I'm sure in the US, in other parts of the world, you need to go and do a SAT exam or whatever it's called now. And actually, every single place in the world, they follow almost the same concept. And I think it's not fair because we can't just test someone knowledge in a time frame of 2 hours. What should we do to change that then?
Yeah, there's a real trade-off between content and tests that make it easy to rank someone in Dubai against someone in Istanbul versus somebody in Boston. And that means you really want the same content, the same curriculum that students study in anticipation of the same exam, so those scores are comparable. And well, that hasn't really been done globally. I actually have a high opinion of OECD and their PISA test, which, because curriculums are quite different, tend to get at more thought-provoking questions, and they do them on a sampled and audited basis so that they can actually have skilled evaluators look at solutions. But in the US, we drive it all with these very dumbed down high stakes exams, the SAT math being a perfect example, or AP calculus, or the nation's report card. And you just look at the questions. I mean, I do know a bit about math, and I look at the questions, and many are poorly formed. Most have nothing to do with life as an adult. And, but you realize it's there because in our country, you can compare a kid in North Dakota to a kid in North Carolina to a kid in Nevada. And it's, do we care more about ranking and sorting kids, or do we care more about giving kids a sense that math can help them in life, opening up their eyes to the beauty and power of math, and making sure they come out of that experience understanding the ideas? And we do a lot of the former and essentially none of the latter. And to your, specifically to your point, if you gave kids a challenge, let's go back to the jelly beans in a jar, and you said to kids, and I've done this with schools, like, challenge your kids to come up with as many different interesting ways to estimate how many jelly beans in the jar. Even fourth graders can blow you away with approaches adults that, I had never thought of. I just said, like, wow, that's so interesting. And you realize, man, that's expansive. That draws on creativity. Now, there's, at the end of the day, logic and math behind it, but it shows that math is really the language of ideas, not a sea of rote. And I think that's where an informed adult can look at those creative approaches and have an opinion on this is really well thought out and could be quite effective. And this one makes not that much sense, but you can't do that challenge and rank a kid from state to state or from country to country. And so it's that trade-off. Do we standardize so we can rank, or do we align with real world needs so we can empower? And I'm clearly in the latter camp.
Yeah, same from my side. Now, the other thing, and I know maybe we are kind of repeating ourselves, and but this is that is the future of humankind, in my opinion. So two things. First, now in the age of AI, everything is changing. Yet we go to schools, and this is global because I spoke on the podcast to different people in the education technology sector. So we still kind of use the inherited system from the 19th century, which is called like it's the kind of a put the children in a factory setup, and then they go from rank to rank. And then the other thing, which is the curriculum itself. Now, in the age of AI, and just as I was telling someone, before this interview, that I never seen a fast-paced development in technology similar to what we are seeing now in the AI. So yeah, we've seen like different waves. So the first one was the transistor back in the 50s, and then we in the 20th century, and then we start to see the microchip, microprocessors, phones, mobile phones, smartphones, but it was like waves that it used to take at least 10 years to see, the impact. Now in the age of AI, we're talking about months. So what fundamentally have to change that? How we could get rid of this very old system to prepare the next generation?
Yeah. Well, I want to follow up. That's a great question. And one of the concepts that recurs in my book is exponential growth, or compound,
Right.
interest growth. And it's a very difficult concept for humans to understand because we tend to focus on the immediacy. So most phenomena look pretty steady as she goes, or in math terms, linear, when we look a few months back and a few months forward. But as you know, technology has advanced for 6 decades exponentially. The chip processing capability has doubled more or less every 2 years. And that means that the amount of change in the next 10 years is more than the amount of change in the last 50, which ought to be an enormous wake-up call for us. If you look at how fast AI is sprinting ahead, none of us can predict where it will be in 10 years, but almost every expert is on record as saying in 10 years, machines will be smarter than any human. And to me, like, okay, we're heading into a world where machines will be smarter than any person. That ought to have profound ramifications for what it means to be human and how humans can kind of have the upper hand in this world. And so what can be done? I've spent maybe 15 years sort of sounding alarm bells in schools. It's very difficult. I mean, there's sort of this locked in sense of inertia. You've got lesson plans, you've got teacher training programs, standardized tests, college admissions, parent expectations, a whole set of things block the change. And I'd say the thing that's likely to break that down, which is a very unfortunate thing, is that I think we're heading into a world where almost all college graduates will face limited to no prospects for employment. And why? Well, if you spent 16 years in school being on the receiving side of here's your assignment, do it. And by the way, don't use ChatGPT or, Claude or some other AI engine, but don't use that because that will do a better job than you can do. But we want you for 16 years to do by hand assignments, knowing that ChatGPT will produce something superior. How hireable are you, right? I mean, why would I want to hire somebody for a large salary who demands an office, who wants to know what title will be on their business card, when I can get it for free or $20 a month or even $200 a month? That's just it. And so we've largely in education said, we are going to run education according to the scores on these high stakes exams that are explicitly designed to be graded by a computer. If it can be graded by a computer, it can be done by a computer. So we will produce generations of adults with skill sets that are aligned with but inferior to what machines can do. That to me seems like a recipe for disaster. And so I feel like as people get that, there's likely to be real push. We're already seeing that, where parents are more concerned. People are really beginning to deeply question the priorities and purpose of school. And my hope is that we make the changes fast enough and in a constructive enough way that most people will end up on the right side of this.
This reminded me also of something happened, I think last year. I had a friend who's looking for a college for his son. And he was telling me, like, I really like this college that they are banning the use of AI tools. That's fantastic. I said, you know what? Like, you're sending your son to learn something that's gonna be obsolete for sure. Because if they are not allowing them to use AI, they have something wrong. And after giving a little bit time to think about it, he said, you know what? Yeah, you're right. Like if they're gonna teach them something there that AI can do, so he's unemployable after 3 years or 4 years in college, like, right? I said, yeah, like, okay, I'm not saying to do everything with AI, but at least learn and choose something that can be useful in the future. You want to say something, Ben?
Yeah, no, I think one of the focal points is, like what, and we see it, like kids just hand in an essay and it seems clearly to have been written almost with no personal intervention by an AI engine. And my advice on that, which I think is reasonable, is to say, if you have an assignment and you're worried about somebody cheating with ChatGPT, put the assignment in front of the students, dump it into your prompt engine for ChatGPT, show them the essay that comes back, and say, if your essay is about that quality, you're going to get a C minus. That is now your floor, and your challenge is to do something far better than that. I also think, it's so interesting, right? Is that think about the workplace environment, right? We'll write an email, people will read it, they'll say, man, that's worth a discussion. Let's get together and talk it through. And so if you're at work and you send an email written by AI, but you know nothing about it, and then somebody says, let's meet about it, and they say, could you elaborate? And you say, hold on, let me just ask ChatGPT. I mean, you're giving your walking papers, right? And education used to be much more about in-person discussion. And to me, it just begs for write something to make a point powerfully, effectively, communicate clearly, but then engage in personal interaction. And so it could be small clusters of kids that read each other's essays and then debate. And the teacher can sort of pop around from group to group to group and observe, and then let the kids self-assess. How do you think you did? How do you think your peers did? Get good at constructive feedback. It goes back to Socrates, right? I mean, it's not like I'm advancing some radical new idea. This has been around for ages. But when did we decide in school that in-person engagement doesn't matter? And yet, I visited a ton of schools in the US and abroad. I tell you, by the time you get to high school, there's almost no question. Like I'll sit there and the kids will be taking notes, colleges as well, in a lot of those classes. And when there is a question or when somebody comes to office hours, the question is almost always, will this be on the test? Or help me figure out how to do this for the test. It's like, that's not core intrinsic curiosity. That's gaming the system. And, so maybe, if in a fortunate set of developments, this will return us to what makes us human, which is having a conversation like we're talking to somebody who asks great questions, who pushes back on things you say, who tell me more. And that you can't cheat with AI on that. Even if it's on your glasses, right? People know it's like, like that's the ultimate way to assess whether somebody knows what they're talking about.
Absolutely, yeah. Like there's nothing that is better than human conversation to learn. And what I've seen, like I think in Scandinavian countries, they took this approach. So especially they to enhance STEM education, they decided to go with like kind of round tables where students they talk to each other. So this is what worked for them in some of the countries. And I think in Denmark, I'm not sure, or in Finland, they don't have something called tests anymore. They removed it, and actually, it went up. I mean, the students' performance went like
Yeah.
exponentially because of this. Now, I know, like from the book.
If I could add about Finland, because a friend of mine is Pasi Sahlberg, and he architected the changes in Finland and wrote Finnish Lessons and Finnish Lessons 2.0. A fantastic person. But when you talk to him about what enabled all the progress and the rethink in Finland, stay tuned, it was a budget crisis. And people say to do this, it's going to cost way more money. A budget crisis. And it forced them to choose. Do we want more data or do we want better teacher training? And they looked hard at that and they said, we're throwing the data overboard. We're going to trust and train our teachers. So it's a very respected profession in Finland. There's a joke about 3 Finns walk into a bar, a lawyer, a doctor, and a teacher. And the bartender asks the lawyer, why are you a lawyer? And they say, oh, I applied to education school. I didn't get in, so I decided to be a lawyer. And the doctor says the same thing. It's like, it's very hard. It's really does elevate, respect, trust, and compensate the profession. And, when I traveled in the US, I was in Wyoming, and one of the people said, well, when a cow is starving, we feed it, we don't weigh it. And in the US, we weigh, we don't feed. We spend billions gathering data, and yet we never step back to say, does this really reflect real learning? And over and over again, the education stories will cite reading and math scores as a proxy for education quality. And that's one of the points I go after in the book, is when you see a number, you can't accept it at face value. You've got to understand there's a story behind every important number coming our way, whether it's a medical diagnosis or a business metric or an education metric or a civics. We live in a world awash with numbers. But if you just take it at face value, if you just, in our country, if somebody says unemployment is 2.9%, and you just say, oh, 2.9%, that's fantastic economy. I push people and I show them that's an incredibly narrow definition of unemployment, subject to massive error bars, and a far more authentic measure is also collected by our Bureau of Labor Statistics, the true TRU unemployment measure. That's not 2.9%, that's 23, 24%. And it's a more authentic measure. But if and I think that's one of the ramifications of a math curriculum that says, do it the way you're taught, put your nose down to the grindstone, drill, and get good at whatever's put in front of you without really ever thinking about it, is then you come out and as an adult and you say, oh, there's a number, it's got to be true. And this is a study that says X causes Y. I never really spent any time on causation versus correlation, so that must be true. And it's like, you need to understand those ideas, because if you're not, you're going to be grossly manipulated.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Now, I know in the book also you have something where you cover about our approach to, risks and uncertainty, right? So I'm interested in knowing about that, especially with the AI, right? Because now we have the AI. And by the way, like, it's controversial, I know, but even people sometimes they get afraid from the AI. They think the AI is like, take their jobs. Sometimes they say this will not be able to help them. And back to, the dilemma of the math and memorizing equations. So I want you to shed some light on this about risks and, uncertainty, because people always, they don't like changes. They don't like, things to be out of their comfort zone. I would put it this way.
Yeah. I was very lucky because as I wound my way through graduate school, I started in physics for a year. And I realized that I didn't love physics, and there were other people that were, more, Richard Feynman level physicists than I was ever going to be. And I found this program in the School of Engineering that was applied math. At the time, it was called Engineering Economic Systems. That's basically professors that were double E professors in a prior life that felt like you could use math modeling tools more broadly. And my thesis advisor was a guy, he passed away recently, named Ron Howard, who, along with Howard Rafa, they were the 2 pioneers of decision analysis. And I have a chapter on decisions. And so I try to explain to the layperson the essentials of decision analysis, but it's eye-opening. And you would think that this would be an important thing in everybody's high school education. I mean, like, our lives depend on the quality of the decisions we make. And what could be more, what could be more important than equipping a high school kid with the skills to make decisions clearly, understanding the risks, understanding the exposure, understanding the upside, understanding their core values and how that relates to it? But is it taught in high school? I mean, there's a great program with people I work with called Decision Education Foundation that gets that to some high schools, but it's, we need it in every high school globally. And it really was an eye opener for me back then, when you start to think about what does risk really mean and what does uncertainty and just how poor humans are at gauging probability. I'll give you a good example is most of the people I talk to are scared to death to get in a driverless car, because there was an accident in the US a couple of years ago in San Francisco where the video was gory and, they're not safe. Like, I don't want to be in a driverless car until it's completely, totally safe. And then you say, well, do you know how many people die a day in the United States in human-driven accidents? It's over 100 die daily. And to date, there have been 2 fatalities involving driverless cars that arguably weren't the driverless car's fault. One was somebody wheeling a shopping cart across a 4-lane highway. That's weird. And then the one that got all the attention was a human-driven car hit a pedestrian who then rolled in front of a driverless car. And what got gruesome is that the driverless car, just the footage was gruesome. And so you realize, like, no, that you're not calibrating your probabilities correctly. And one sensational anecdote shouldn't overwhelm a whole body of data. And so, I have several examples that I think are, you're thinking about changing jobs and what a new career path might look like and how you weigh the uncertainties and what class of decisions ought to be just the expected value and what need to pay a lot more attention to the swings in financial circumstances that really make a difference. So an example is you might get an online offer and it costs you $12 to insure a hotel night. Well, like those are very low stakes. So you just should take the probabilities, look at the range of outcomes. And if it's a win, which it never is, do it. And when it's a modest loss and you're just being scammed, avoid it. Easy. But then if you think about health insurance, life insurance, there are some really high stakes things where the swings might be hundreds of thousands of dollars and it's no longer symmetric, right? If somebody says, would you take a 50-50 bet? If it's heads, you get another $250,000. And if it's tails, you lose the same amount. You'd have to be foolish, I think, to take that 50-50 bet, unless you were Bill Gates or somebody. And so I sort of draw those out and they're really, like decision education focused. They do things with middle school kids. These are not elusive. I got to it in graduate school, but we're not talking about graduate school concepts. We're talking about things that at a very young age we can understand, and they're powerful, illuminating, interesting concepts. And that's sort of the basic point of Aftermath is, should we focus on the ideas that change your life trajectory, or should we dwell in the world of rote math mechanics your phone does perfectly, you will never use, but it makes it convenient for admissions officers and education bureaucrats and legislators to rank you? To me, it's clear, but schools go the opposite direction. It's not teachers' fault. They don't want to do this, but it's a set of high stakes policies that vary by nation. And so, I'm often most excited by smaller countries, like in Estonia, that's thinking boldly about education priorities. And small agile nation. I work with some of the educators in Ukraine and saying, like, don't rebuild in the model of the of traditional education. Here's your chance to really rethink it. And the upside, so back to risk, right? The upside's enormous. We have a lot more control over the path than I think we often think. People will perceive hard constraints like, well, the curriculum is this, so we can't do anything. Well, you say, like, is that a hard constraint or is that a perceived constraint? Even for a family, it's like school says X, but you've got a lot of time at home, right? And so you can either tell your kid to spend 6 hours this week on Khan Academy on arc sequence, could do that, get a slightly higher math score, fine. Or you could say, let's spend 6 hours this week applying math to things that come up in your world. Like, and my book's full of that. It's got all these real world examples where there's a math concept, it's relevant and important. I do my best to explain it in simple terms, and then I invite the reader to apply it to other things coming their way.
I always tell people, one of the things that I wish they taught us in school, which is related to math actually, is the way how, again, because you come from that background and you did it for a long time, that the math that venture capitalists they use, to build right their projections for
Yeah.
their LPs. I said, you know what, like, and this is again, it relates to an entrepreneur also as well, because you need to take multiple bets. You need to learn how to do multiple things. Uh, and again, it's math, but not the math that they teach us in school. And I said, if I had this knowledge, I would say maybe at the age of 18, maybe I would have been in completely different place today. But okay, I learned it late. It's good. It's better than never. But again, this is what I am big, I would say, fan of everything that changed the current status quo in education. Math is the majority of part of it, but again, like I was asking someone why they don't teach them economics, why they don't teach them about how banks works, like why they don't teach them about, I don't know, like there's plenty of things. Why they teach them about history and geography, of course it's good knowledge, but there's plenty of current, I would say, present things that they need to learn about. And I figured out, no, they have no clue. And you just mentioned at the beginning, Ted, something that today we are more in a age where we have, companies doing less with more, more with less.
Yeah.
And, I'm sure like you've seen what's happening now with some companies, maybe 20 or 30 employees getting to $100 million ARR with just like few number of people. Uh, so the question is, how we can take this and apply it to have also like more entrepreneurs, more people who are really eager to go and do you know, leave good impact on their cities, countries,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I find it so interesting. You read all the stories, and there are many these days about the looming impact of AI. And you'll see some that say it's going to wipe out lots of jobs, and others that say it's actually going to create lots of jobs. But they're all based on this assumption that AI is like the weather, right? Will it rain tomorrow or will it be sunny? And we can forecast it, but we can't control it. Well, we can control the impact of AI. We have agency in that. And if we equip generations of of adults globally in any given country, if the more adults that are equipped to take advantage and use AI productively, they can lift up their organizations, right? And so in my dream world, we would be producing wave after wave after wave of young adults and some older adults that plug in, but wave after wave of adults really informed at taking advantage and using AI to lift up the organization they join, or to create something new. And what I think is unequivocally true is that if you look at existing jobs, the majority are on their way out. It just, you travel around Asia, right? The factories don't even have people in them, and restaurants are largely automated. The number of lawyer jobs are going way down. Amazon says it's going to double revenues over 5 years, but have fewer employees. Existing jobs are going down. Many categories are going away, but there's no limit to how many jobs and paths we can create. And so what I find so shocking, right, is when I visit schools, the idea that you could actually create your own path is largely driven out of kids' minds by the time they're in 12th grade. I guest teach a class at a well-known university here, and each year I ask the mostly seniors at this college, if schools shut down tomorrow, not just your school, but every school, there was not going to be one more education opportunity for you. And with that went all the career services offices. How many of you are already good at something today that you enjoy and you could support yourself doing? out of 100, there might be 2 or 3 each year. 2 or 3. And I say, like, all of this is what you're needing to do again and again and again. But I think we reap what we sow, right? If you spend 12, 14, 16, 18 years in school, being conditioned to, here's your assignment, do it, without giving kids any agency to create what they want to do, by the time you're 22, you're sort of beaten down. And it's very hard to remediate that. And it's like, why would we do that, right? I mean, if we were back in the industrial era, we had a reason to do that in the industrial era. With 99% of the jobs in the economy were rote factory line jobs or paperwork jobs, and you expected somebody to do it for 45 years, good. Get rid of their creativity, get rid of their curiosity, get rid of their audacity, because you don't want a challenging, critiquing, out of the box thinker on an assembly line or shuffling paper. Those jobs are all automated, right? Those are exactly what you want. But school by design crushes that out of kids. And I worked for several years, tragically died of pancreatic cancer in 2020, but my partner for several years was Sir Ken Robinson. And any listener that has not watched his TED Talk, he gave a TED Talk in 2005 that put the TED organization on the map, and to this day is the most watched TED Talk of all time. Not the most watched education TED Talk, the most watched TED Talk of all time. Sir Ken Robinson, Do Schools Kill Creativity? He's funny, he's perceptive, and I always say to Ken, you put a knife in the back of traditional education and everybody's laughing. But he makes the point. Schools by design crush creativity out of young adults at the exact time when that's the single most important character trait you can have.
Yeah, this is the sad truth, I would say. Let's say sad truth. Ted, I know also you produce some films and you're working on one, right? So tell me more.
Well, I did my first foray when I got interested in this. I sort of thought about strategy and optimization. Where could I spend my time and money to have the most impact? And I narrowed it down to organizing and funding a film. And so 10 and a half years ago, it premiered at Sundance. That film, and we'll put it in your show notes, was called Most Likely to Succeed. And there'll be a free link for any of your listeners, but I would urge them to watch the first 15 minutes because we sort of tee up the technology trends and what that means for education. It's brilliant. And the credit goes to the director, who was amazing. But we show, computers beating Kasparov in chess. And then we show Watson beating Ken Jennings in Jeopardy. And we show technology writing better prose than most journalists on a film done in the can 11 years ago, before OpenAI was even formed. And we're showing computers writing better prose than the best journalists. And we just sort of lay out, this has profound consequences for what skills and mindsets adults are going to need. And I sort of put some money into a bunch of films along the way after that. The first film I was the only funder and dove into full force. And probably despite my involvement, it was really good, not because of, and then I sort of was a participant in others. They were okay. I sort of decided, I'm not going to do any more films. And then I visited this district in Virginia where they just, in our nation, and I suspect it's broadly applicable, there's this mindset of either career, send you off to some, career shop, career academy with an auto body shop and whatever. And you kind of part ways with school. And it's kind of like viewed with stigma as kind of like the last chance option for the kids who can't cut it. But over here is what really is important, which is the academic. Either or, stigmatized, overweighted, and glorified. And this district just rebalanced, right? They just said, we're going to have every kid, whether they intend to go to college or more likely want to go directly to a career, will spend about a third of their time in high school on career-based learning and 2/3 on more traditional academics. And we connect the two. And it's just like, whoa, like so many kids that otherwise would be lost, find their lane. The kids are energized, kids that, in a lot of high schools, you've got like the AP track and then the mainstream track and then the last chance kids that get on the bus and go over there. Here, they're all in this pool working together. And the kid that might do really well in a math class is suddenly having, true for me, by the way, someone who does really well in math class is side by side in woodworking. And I'm like, even though my dad was a carpenter and my brother builds all the cabinets for his house and does a lot of work for his church, I'm a disaster. But there's a humility that comes from that, because if I'm next to somebody who's great at woodworking, I no longer think that they're the dummy and I'm the genius. And they suddenly have the same view. They say, like, that guy's really good at math, but boy, he's hopeless with this. And it's just reinforcing that respect all paths. And some kids will find carpentry a great path forward. And we show kids like that. Some kids will decide university is the right thing and pursue a medical degree, but why not, when it's free, when it's early? Don't do what Germany does and say at age 14, here is your path. We're telling you what you can do. But ages 14 through 18, exposing you rich, interesting experiences you can sample and decide whether you like it or not, whether you're good at it or not, internships and apprenticeships. And we call the film multiple choice because instead of training kids for multiple choice exams, they equip kids with the skills and mindsets that give them multiple interesting options in life. And it's like, why wouldn't we do that for all kids? What a gift. What a gift. And it's not in the film, but in my talks, I often refer and even show. I'll send you this link for show notes as well. But
sure,
there's a short video. There's a 2-minute version and a 3-minute version. And if you Google MIT graduation day, light bulb, wire, battery, there was a 45-year tenured professor at MIT. I have to say this slowly because people don't believe me, who concluded that MIT graduates were learning very little real science and engineering. Think about that. You're an MIT graduate and you haven't learned much science or engineering. And so to make his point, they go on graduation day. You have the student speaker. We're now proud graduates of the most respected engineering institution in the world. And they give each of them a light bulb, a wire battery, and say, can you light this up? And the kids are indignant, right? Like, why are you bothering me with such a pedestrian challenge? Of course, I'm an MIT grad. Of course, I can light up a light bulb. And then they can't. And the point is that had they along the way shattered a master electrician, that master electrician would light up the light bulb like that, right? Now, that master electrician might not be facile with Kirchhoff's law or Coulomb's law. They might not do as well on the AP physics exam, but they know how electricity works. And wouldn't that be a great world where kids coming through high school had the option to become an electrician, had the option to go to engineering college, but actually were a better student, or we're just a plain adult, and when the fuse box goes out, knows what to do about it, right? And I think there's power in that, of instead of falsely separating applied versus theory, integrating them. Instead of falsely separating career versus college, integrating them. And, it's powerful, and you see it in these student stories. So that film will be out in a couple months. We've got a film premiere in mid-September. And then I don't sell my films to anybody, so it will not be on a streamer. We do community screening initiatives. So we will make this available to anyone who wants to screen it, because the whole point of these films is to bring communities of people together. Back to what we talked about 30 minutes ago, people in person discussing constructively interesting, bold ideas. And we hope deciding we could do this. Let's work together to reach a bold, aspiring goal that will elevate the future of our kids and our community. I think that's worth doing these days.
Very, very inspiring. Just one thing on that, Ted, is I think also the expectation from parents. I mean, like what society have put a pressure on us, because I know a lot of people. Yeah, you have to go and become an engineer. I talked to the guy, after 20 years, he said, you know what, I hate it. I wish I was a cook. I want to cook food. I want to be the chef at the restaurant.
Yeah.
But I was forced to do that. It happens a lot, but because they were not exposed, little bit pressure from parents, society. Oh no, this is not a good career path. But I like to be optimistic, and I'm starting to see some changes. At
Yeah.
least, in Dubai, in Turkey, across like multiple countries, people started to understand that there are like some other options, other choices, and it's not a shame to go and work for something that can earn you money and you like. There's no harm in this. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
uh,
It's a personal anecdote. A couple of years ago, I was at a friend's son got married, and he had graduated from arguably the most prestigious law school in America. So he was getting married, and the reception included lots of classmates from Harvard Law School. And so I talked to a bunch, and I said, "So, what are you doing now?" Well, I'm working for a sports team. I'm writing fiction. I mean, I couldn't find anybody that was in law, and they all say, "I tried it for a year. How I hated it." Right? And you think about 4 years of undergraduate, 3 years of law school, 7 years, probably $500,000, and a year into it, you pull the ripcord. And they said the only classmates that were still in these grinding professions, where like you're going to do estate plans over and over, or look at corporate M&A documents over and over. It's like, it just wears you out. It's sort of soul sucking in many ways. And AI will do a lot of that. And they said the only ones who are still in those jobs are the ones who were over their head in student loan debt and just had to keep working 90 hours a week with billable hours to try to dig out of that debt. And I'm not saying that every lawyer hates their job. I'm sure some
no.
love it, but oftentimes, right, you make that bet before you have information. You go to 4 years of undergraduate, 4 years of medical school, 2 years of an insane residency, and you're a radiologist, and suddenly AI is better than you at diagnosing screens. And it's like, those are high stakes bets where the information and insight comes late. And I think the decision chapter I have sort of explains the value of gaining information early in the process to redirect your priorities so that you have a more sensible allocation of time, effort, and money. And that's what this film shows. And I think that's what the point the book underscores is thinking clearly about how do we afford people with the right resources and the right perspective to move forward in life in a way that they find fulfilling.
Right. Ted, as we are almost coming close to end, I want to ask you something. If you put again your VC hat, and at the same time, what you uncovered about, of course, math and the other topics in education, and you want to advise the new generation of entrepreneurs on what they should pursue and how to choose the right, I would say, innovation to go after, what you would tell them?
Well, when I was active in venture, I had a pretty good roadmap on particular interesting emerging sectors. And what helped me a lot, right, was in early in the 1990s, I was onto the internet. And so, that was a good time to understand just how big a deal the internet would be and to understand what exponential growth means, to know that it was going to be an enormous opportunity. So I'm so far removed that I'm not in a particularly good position to say, this niche of data security or this issue, aspect of Salesforce management or whatever. But I would say this, oftentimes this was interesting, right? My venture firm started in 1970, portfolio of over 1,000 companies. And a few years ago, we went through this exercise of looking at past investments and, as best we could, recreate the partnership sentiment before we made the investment. And so we knew, did it do really well, pretty well, so-so, failure, and what degree of uniform enthusiasm or skepticism was in our partnership. And our preconceived notion was that our very best companies would have been universally endorsed. And the worse the performance, the more skepticism there would be. It was the opposite. The companies that everybody thought were good ideas did anywhere from okay to badly. There was no controversial edge to it. It was not challenging anything. The companies that did really well often had a partner who came very close to saying, I would throw my body across the tracks to block this investment. A partner who would say, I'm going to be embarrassed if our partnership backs such a terrible idea, because the best ideas go directly in the face of conventional thinking. And so if this will resonate. If you are an entrepreneur listening to this, you will say, you just told me something obvious, or yes, that actually is my life mission. Like I am the contrarian. I love situations where 99% of the people are wrong because I can see something that I think is right and important. But I'd say that, many of the listeners have young kids of their own, or grandkids, or relatives, or kids in the neighborhood, whatever. Empowering kids to have that mindset despite the school they're in, sometimes because of the school they're in, but by and large, despite school, despite curriculum, despite high stakes tests, to come through intact with that basic thing that makes us human, to want to create something from scratch that makes the world better, that will serve these kids well, and they will be joyful. They will have real purpose in life. And it doesn't solve all the mental health issues we're seeing with young kids, but it gets to important aspects of that, right? Because if a kid is told year in and year out, I know you don't see any point in this, but do it because some anonymous college admissions officer wants you to. Do it because it's on the test. Do it because some education policymaker that couldn't tell an arc secant from a Taylor series expansion says you've got to understand arc secants and Taylor series expansion. That sucks the purpose out of kids. It sucks the audacity out of kids. And I think as stewards of the next generation, those are the values we need to stand for. And because we're heading into a world where someone with an entrepreneurial mindset, particularly someone who knows how to leverage AI, has unlimited amounts of interesting opportunities. But if those are missing, take my word for it, they are going to be in for a world of hurt.
Yeah, and I think the same applies also on the other side of the table. So this is why in the States, you have a lot of VCs, you have a lot of, it's been like for a while over there, but at least in this part of the world where I live, I'm telling people we need more people also who believe in these like young generation. Although, like to your point, I'm kind of similar to you here, Ted. Like many times people told me, and it even happened in my career, like you're choosing the wrong company to work for. And I'm saying, no, I'm seeing something I think you're not seeing. Spotting the signals. And of course, this is my mission. Maybe I'm first time I'm revealing this. So my mission is to change the mindset of people, at least in this part, that what we call the emerging markets, that you need to encourage people to go and take the risk. Like there is nothing perfect from the first time. You need to keep trying. And this is why, I'm telling people, go and read about venture capitalists, like read how these guys, they think. The VC mindset, the famous book, like keep trying to put your bets on multiple things. And one of them would definitely succeed. It will return all, your investments, of course, but in a human perspective, not only like from I would say, money perspective. So definitely to your point, that finally, I really enjoyed the conversation. Where people can get in touch and when the book is expected to be out.
So the book will be out in the next couple months for sure. It's to be, by the time people listen to it, I may have resolved this. I've been on a path to self-publish. My first two books were name brand publishers. If you want to talk about an industry averse to innovation, it's the publishing industry. And so, yeah, so like the basic deal is deliver me a manuscript, great. Tell me what you're going to do to sell the book, great. We'll print it. I can find somebody who can typeset it, lay it out, and print it. We'll ship it to bookstores. Nobody buys books in bookstores anymore, basically, unfortunately. And then when you generate sales, which I've been able to do, we'll take over 90% of the profits. It doesn't take advanced math to look at that and say that's not a terribly good deal. And I think I've got enough of a reputation that people will take it seriously. I in real time, we got approached by a publisher who says I can move really quickly, and here's how I think I can really help. And so I'm kind of evaluating that. So I'd say somewhere between the next month to next 2.5 months, it'll be out. And I'll put in the show notes how you can get notified of what we do. But it's the most important book I'll ever write. I'm not sure how many. I do run into the challenge when I say to people, I've got a book that'll make you really love math and see the power of its ideas. As soon as you say math, People say, oh, like I got somebody else I got to talk to. And so I got to get over that hurdle. And so that's my challenge. But I do think that I hope when people have an open mind and say, let me take a look, they'll say, oh my gosh. I mean, I'll give you a very specific example. One of the profs in my department pioneered the whole area of evidence-based medicine. And I talk about conditional probability. This will sound esoteric for ending the conversation, but bear with me. I talk about conditional probability, right? And so the number of medical doctors that understand conditional probability is less than 5%. And to make it very explicit, if you have a certain disease, the probability that the test gives you an accurate answer is quite high. So if I have X, the probability of a positive test indicating X is 90%. Mm-hmm. The reverse is not, those numbers don't flip, right? If the test says I've got X, the probability I actually have X can be off by over an order of magnitude. And so we walked through this for a particular form of cancer, and we showed that the test, when you take it one direction, have the disease, accuracy of the test, it's about 80%, 80 to 90%. Test is positive, the probability you actually have that disease is 2%. And yet, this isn't covered. Even in, 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of high school math, 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of medical school, 2 years of residency, and doctors get that wrong again and again and again. And so they'll tell a patient, this very accurate test means you've almost certainly got this horrible disease, and people panic, and people rush, and they make bad decisions. And if they understood conditional probability, which is really important, they say, well, wait, you don't have this quite right. And they know what questions to ask. And you can inquire with ChatGPT, here with the test, here's what it said. Now let me ask you this. What, if I turn it around, what's the likelihood I really have this disease? It will tell you, but you need to know how to ask that question. And your life may well depend on it. So this isn't rounding error stuff. This isn't a point or 2 or 3 points or 10 points on an SAT or whatever, or a 10th of a point on your GPA. This could make or break your life. And so is it important to help people understand these ideas? I think it is. And you can tell I'm passionate about this.
100%. So Ted, I'm gonna wait the show notes. It's gonna be of course, in the links to put them in the show notes, so people can get notified about the book. But by the way, if you go to the website, I checked it myself. So you find all the work that Ted have done before. Plenty of things, especially the films you mentioned. Like, highly recommended for people to go and check that out, and all the references also we made during the day, the TED Talk and others. So everything, it will be available in the show notes if you are listening on any of your favorite podcasting apps, or if you're watching this on YouTube, you will find it in the description. Ted, I can't thank you enough. Very engaging, very eye-opening, I would say, discussion with you today. And again, to what you mentioned at the beginning of the episode about having the conversation. This is why I love and I'm passionate about doing this podcast, because it opens also my own, horizons to few things, talking to people like yourself who've been in the industry for a long time. And of course, hoping that we can together inspire other people. So thank you again for being here with me today. And this is for the audience. You guys, if you just discovered this for the first time, thank you for passing by. I hope you enjoyed. Small favor, subscribe and share it with your friends and colleagues. We're trying to make an impact. So the more we reach to people, the better it becomes. And for the people who keeps coming again and again, thank you very much for your support and all what you're doing for the podcast this year. You pushed us high in the top 200 charts on the Apple platform. So we are in multiple countries in the entrepreneurship section. Thank you for that. And I'm trying to break a record. We are on 8 countries at the same time currently. So trying to reach more countries very soon. So again, can't do this without you, audience, and of course, my guests, including you, Ted. So thank you very much. And as I say always, stay tuned for a new episode of the CTO Show with Mehmet very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Hit that subscribe button. Share the show with your tech-savvy friends and fellow entrepreneurs. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. Your support means the world to us.